Right now, on the Citizen Report, we take a closer look at the Electoral College, why it's important for America, why our Founding Fathers instituted such a system, and how it works. Coming up next.
This is the Citizen Report with Jonathan Shannon.
And welcome to the Citizen Report. I'm Jonathan Shannon. Thank you for tuning in this week. We're going to be doing something a little bit differently here. We're going to be talking about something called the Electoral College. Now, just what is that elusive term? What does it mean? It is actually a constitutionally mandated system in our country, the United States of America. It's not just a law, it's actually in our Constitution. It is something our Founding Fathers put into place as sort of a safeguard. It is something that has come under controversy, especially every presidential term, every presidential election, I should say. Now, the Electoral College is based on the votes of the 50 states in our union. It is not based on the popular vote. That is where the controversy seems to be. Now, a lot of people think that the United States of America is a democracy. And to some extent, it does have traits of a democracy. However, there are a lot of things about this country that just prove beyond a reasonable doubt that it is not a democracy. In fact, categorically speaking, this country is actually a republic. Now, just what are the two? A democracy is where basically the people vote directly for the issues of their country, whereas a republic is where the people of such a country, such as the United States of America, vote representatives to represent their views and how they should implement things into law in our country. Now, let me give an example of what it would be like if we had a pure democracy in this country. Now, Congress, you might actually be surprised to know, when you turn on a news channel, for example, you hear about these big ticket items like healthcare and other issues facing this country, and make no mistake, there are plenty of important issues. And every issue is important, but there are a lot of issues that Congress has to deal with that actually are quite mundane. Take, for instance, and I'm using this as a pure example, this is something I just totally made up. Let's say a 2-mile stretch of road in the middle of Alaska, nowhere near any town, but for some reason this road is one that is maintained by the federal government. Now, let's just say that the Congress has to vote whether or not to repave this road. Now, in a pure democracy, this road would have to be voted on by the people of our country. Obviously, that would create quite an issue, because basically, if we were always voting on every single problem that ever comes up in the federal government, like, say, in a case like that, then, of course, it would just be chaos, because we would be voting essentially every day on probably page after page after page of issues. Now, that's kind of an extreme analogy, if you will, of what a pure democracy might be like if we had one here. Now, a country like Switzerland has pretty much a democracy, and for them, it works to an extent. I'm not saying that they vote on everything like that necessarily, but I'm saying that it works in smaller countries, or it can work in smaller countries, but in a country of a size like this, millions, hundreds of millions of people, it just doesn't work. That brings me to the Electoral College. Now, the Electoral College has been in place ever since our Constitution was ratified. The Electoral College is basically this. When you vote, there are two phases to voting for a president. You have the popular vote, which is basically the cumulative number, if you will, of voters in this country who vote for a president in each of the 50 states, plus, of course, District of Columbia. And the popular vote does decide who they want to be the next president. But then there's phase 2. because while the popular vote makes the decision as to who they want to be the next president, it is actually the Electoral College that actually makes the decision, the binding decision as to who the next president will be. Now, when you vote for a president, whoever that person might be, you're actually casting a vote, a ballot, for the electors who will, on your behalf, cast the vote for that person to be president. At least that's how, theoretically, that is how the Electoral College is supposed to be. As I explained a moment ago, the Electoral College serves as a safeguard. It guards against primarily two things. It guards against stolen votes, and it guards against basically the cities garnering so much power, the rural parts of this country don't get a fair share of say in the presidential elections. And if it were so that the popular vote would make the decision, then the cities would be where the presidential candidates would only have to focus on. They wouldn't have to care about the rural America. And that right there is itself a safeguard. Now, the Electoral College also guarantees that the person who becomes president has to reach out to many different people of different backgrounds in order to win. Because people in urban areas, they're different than people in rural areas. And the president has to reach out and basically synthesize them as a whole in order to win the Electoral College. In order to win the votes in the Electoral College, you have to win 270 electoral votes. So basically, to recap, when you vote, you're essentially on election day, instead of one election, you essentially have 50 elections taking place simultaneously, plus one. So it actually makes it 51. And District of Columbia, of course, is not a state, but a federal district, essentially. So by now, I hope that you're beginning to understand why the Electoral College is vital. And not just vital, but why we should revere it as a good system for the United States of America. There are forces in play in this country who would love nothing more than to abolish the Electoral College. I'm about to tell you about one movement in particular by the name of the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact, abbreviated as NPV. Now, it is a system that certain states are trying to initiate. It is basically under the radar, and several states have already signed on, primarily in the Northeast. And in specific terms, what is applicable to us is that North Carolina is considering it. Now, they haven't actually signed on to the system, but it is something North Carolina, the state government, has considered recently. Now, basically, if it worked, if these people actually did what they were supposed to do, they would rally to amend the Constitution. That is how the rule of law works here. But instead, they're trying to go around that by basically saying that having states sign on as basically making a promise, essentially, that if the national popular vote goes one way, but their state would adhere to that popular vote. North Carolina, again, is one state that is considering that. That is something we cannot allow to happen. Now, for example, just as an example as to what could happen if such a thing were in place, California, who voted for John Kerry in 2004, now if the popular vote were to dictate to them how they would vote, then President George W. Bush would have carried the state. Now, obviously, without getting into politics, that is something that would go against the wishes of the people of that state. Now, the national election is decentralized. It is essentially 50 states plus the District of Columbia conducting their own elections on election day. It is basically 50 plus 1 elections on that one day. Now, urban areas tend to lean to the left and vote Democrat, whereas rural areas and even suburban areas tend to lean more to the right and vote Republican. Now, the Electoral College does more than just bring the voting power to be more equal, but it cannot be underscored enough that the rural areas get a more equal standing in the elections. Basically, it prevents any one part of the country or any one city or group of cities from taking the entire vote. It is to ensure that the whole country gets a fair share of the vote. If you look at a map, visually speaking, you would see that not even the size of the state would take the vote. It is based on the population. Our founding fathers feared a tyranny that would take place in any number of ways, but one of them being that a bare majority, by that I mean just the slimmest of majorities, could carry the entire country. Of course, such a thing, if it were to happen, would just rip this country apart. Even under the Electoral College. In the year 2000, President Bush barely became president, based on a few votes. Now take note, however, that was not because of the national popular vote. It was because of the fact that in the state of Florida specifically, there were just a very such a razor thin of a difference in the number of votes between Al Gore and who would become President George W. Bush. Now, in the case of the state, there you do have the factor of the popular vote, whereas on the national level, you don't have the popular vote, but instead you have the Electoral College. Fast forward to 2016. The popular vote allegedly went in favor of Hillary Clinton. However, when you look not at the numbers themselves, but as the 50 states in terms of the popular vote of each state, you will soon recognize that the people actually wanted Donald Trump as president. And in a way, that is how the Electoral College provided for a safeguard for our country, for our system. So the Electoral College is something that we should revere. And for that matter, the Constitution. We should revere the Constitution. So don't let anybody try to tell you the Electoral College is outdated or that it is preventing the will of the people, when in fact it is ensuring that all 50 states, the popular vote of the 50 states, all get their equal share of the vote. And that comes to the end of this edition of the Citizen Report. Thank you for tuning in. I'm Jonathan Shannon, and I hope to see you right back here again next time. Have a great week ahead.